Well, welcome. My name is Susan Phalen. I am a Uniting Church minister in Australia. I am the operations manager and deputy controller for the New South Wales Disaster Recovery Chaplaincy Network. And we are going to talk today about our development of some resilience building resources for pastoral carers and communities. In the beginning, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the city of Sydney, where our DRCN office is located, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We all know that effective disaster recovery is holistic, that it accounts for the physical and the emotional, the psychological, and the spiritual aspects of a person and a community's well-being. Disasters and traumatic events not only shake people's physical environment, but their worldviews and their experience of life and of justice and of faith. In recognizing this, building resilience within a community should involve equipping and supporting its faith communities to better understand and participate in disaster recovery. In Australia, each state and territory has responsibility for emergency management and disaster welfare under guidelines set by our federal government. The Emergency Management Plan, or M-Plan, is actually a series of disaster response and recovery plans which encompass a wide range of arrangements involving scores of agencies, both government and non-government. And this welfare services functional area covers all the arrangements developed for people's welfare as a result of disasters within the state. Five prominent organizations within the disaster welfare system are known as community partners and work with the government under a written memorandum of understanding. These are the Australian Red Cross of New South Wales, which is responsible for personal support of evacuees and assistance with registrations in evacuation centers and coordination of outreach to affected areas. The Salvation Army emergency services are responsible for the provision of food in evacuation centers. The Adventist Development and Relief Agency, ADRA, is responsible for finding and arranging accommodation for displaced evacuees. Anglicare, which is an outreach arm of the Anglican Church, is responsible for personal requisites such as clothing and personal hygiene products. And the Uniting Church in Australia, the Synod of New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory, through Disaster Recovery Chaplaincy Network, or DRCN, is responsible for the provision of multi-faith and interdenominational chaplaincy in evacuation centers, recovery centers, and other affected areas. And we also support faith communities such as churches and mosques as they contribute to the recovery of the wider community. The DRCN was formed after substantial discussion in the State Welfare Services Committee, which recognized that people's faith is an important factor in their recovery from crisis, and that faith communities are important support mechanisms in the process of recovery. Various denominations had approached the committee to become providers of chaplaincy, but it was recognized that the multicultural and multi-faith character of New South Wales required a network of chaplains to match. The DRCN gathers faith leader and pastoral carers from a wide range of denominations and faith groups, which are representative of the larger Australian population. And our chaplains are faith community leaders such as ministers and priests and rabbis, imams, monks, who are recommended by their faith overseers for the work. They are given an intensive 2-day training course in crisis and disaster work, and they're assessed on their attendance, their attitude, and their aptitude. They also are required to be under professional supervision in an organization that has overseeing authority, and they are required to renew their accreditation every 3 years. The DRCN is managed, as I said earlier, as a ministry of the Uniting Church. It has a coordinator who is the Reverend Dr. Stephen Robinson, and an operations manager, who is me. And we have volunteer duty officers and logistical support officers. When a disaster occurs or is likely, Disaster Welfare Services contacts our duty officer, who is available 24 hours a day, and the chaplains are deployed to the event. Usually, I go along with them. Generally, community partners are activated to both natural and human-caused disasters. When there has been a terrorist event, where there has been injury or loss of life, or where significant trauma is involved, or significant loss of property. Even though Australia is and always has been a land of drought, of bushfires and flooding rains, we are, like everyone else, experiencing natural disasters more frequently and with greater intensity than ever recorded. One of our most devastating natural disasters is the ongoing drought. Despite recent rains, 100% of New South Wales is drought declared. And most of you would know that this leaves farmers hindered by debt and those psychological wounds. It's seen whole communities and country towns die because there's no money to support businesses and trade. And we have had to modify our response as DRCN chaplains somewhat to support communities who are going through this ongoing crisis. One of the key historic problems with chaplaincy in Australia is that well-intentioned volunteers have taken on this title and attended emergency situations without any authority or accountability, creating difficulty for the disaster-affected community and people, and also for the local faith leaders. In some disasters, this has caused a level of distrust towards chaplaincy and indeed towards any faith-based volunteers on some sites as a result. And so we recognize that even when chaplaincy is done well, if it comes into a community from the outside and it leaves without reference to the local faith communities, it can disempower those in the context of their community's recovery. Community always works best when they're involved and have a voice in their recovery. To overcome this, an important part of the DRCN's charter is to build and carry resources to enable and equip local congregations and leaders of faith groups. When DRCN chaplains enter a community, One of us will contact the faith leaders, usually through the local ministers association or similar body, and explain the work that we do. Beyond this, we run training nights explaining what happens to communities in disasters, talking about issues of loss, clergy stress, self-care, and phases of recovery. And all of these things have been seen to be very valuable for both religious leaders and community leaders. DRCN has excellent links with other agencies which come into town when a disaster occurs, and we help to link local ministers into this response. And so over time, DRCN has been valued both within the state and in local communities because we bring an integrated response, accountability to our structure and to our controllers. And we believe then it helps deliver the best care of disaster-affected people and their carers. We recognize that pre-disaster information and training is vitally important. And so with this in mind, DRCN has created several resources for churches and faith groups and pastoral carers to be educated and to plan toward disaster response well ahead of time and to help create resilient communities and carers. So I'm going to talk about a few of the resources that we have developed. And first of all, we've put together a booklet and a video entitled Good Advice for Churches, Congregations, and Faith Groups Ministering in Disaster-Affected Communities. The Australian religious community is diverse and incorporates many faiths and Christian denominations. One thing we have in common is the desire to respond to human need, particularly when people are affected by disaster and traumatic events. There is a sense of human connectedness when we see our neighbor in need. And by reason of the empathy that people of faith have toward people in need, churches and faith groups are strategically placed, we believe, to respond with care and to help those who are suffering. We also appreciate that there are many other groups who take care of people in the midst of a disaster. Australia has a very strong ethos of volunteering, and the volunteers in many of our emergency services are the backbone of our society's disaster response. They are the backbone of our communities. This good advice booklet and training resource was developed out of interviews and meetings with ministers who were involved in 3 different disaster events in regional areas of New South Wales. The challenge was for us to find out what churches and other faith groups should know ahead of time to prepare before a disaster strikes. And the result is a booklet which guides a congregational faith group planning group through the issues they can be aware of. And so we talk about pre-planning, and that is having an up-to-date pastoral directory or a directory of the people who regularly gather together, an inventory of the facilities where you meet, so that when a disaster happens, you know how to respond quickly and in the most effective way as possible. All of us know how quickly bushfires can spread. Depending on the wind, they're out of control almost before we know it. And it's really important for us to know within our community those who are elderly or who live alone, who might not have a way to evacuate when a disaster happens. And so we strive to help people put together a team that can contact people quickly and help them get out of a situation if necessary. We also talk about ways to organize activities for children. Children are often, I want to say forgotten, but when adults are so busy trying to recover from a disaster or in the midst of a disaster, a lot of times if schools have been closed, there's nothing much around for children to do. We also talk a bit about donations and really encourage congregations to come together to donate money to whatever appeal the community is using. We found that people are wonderful and very good-natured and very giving, but quite often our facilities are overrun with used goods that we can't get rid of, and then it's quite costly to try to dispose of those. We also talk about what long-term recovery looks like and how churches and faith groups can be partners organizing fun events for communities or facilitating interfaith memorial services. A year ago in March, New South Wales experienced quite a devastating bushfire on the southern coast of New South Wales. A year later, memorial service, interfaith memorial service was held on the beach which was part of the area devastated by the fire. It's striking that on that day it was cold and rainy. A year ago it was windy and hot, and quite a horrible scene. So we have a book and a video resource which explains each section and which allows time for the group to work on a number of tasks to come to a plan which works for their church or faith group. One evening is sufficient to build a short plan and to develop a checklist for their preparation and response to the disaster event. This was originally prepared specifically for New South Wales, but it's been adapted for use anywhere. And so any congregation or faith group can use this. We've also put together a resource called Bread for the Journey, because we know that especially in disaster settings, chaplains are called to be a non-anxious presence in the midst of chaos. But it's very difficult to be an agent of care when one is anxious or stressed or burned out. The only way chaplains will be a healthy presence among the people we care for is to keep ourselves healthy. So disaster recovery chaplains, indeed all of us, need good self-awareness and the ability to understand the situations in our lives that cause anxiety and stress, and to have strategies in place to help us lead healthy, balanced, and resilient lives. Most of the 300 chaplains who are a part of the New South Wales DRCN are working full-time in other ministry roles. Many are in congregational ministry, and others are employed as institutional chaplains in hospitals and jails, in schools, in aged care facilities, mental health facilities, or other community settings. A great deal of research over the years has shown that clergy are especially prone to anxiety, stress, compassion fatigue, and burnout. This is due in part to both the compassionate nature of ministry agents and the increasing expectations of our ministry roles. Especially in country New South Wales, as congregational membership is declining and there are fewer ordained or commissioned ministry agents in placement, clergy who remain find themselves stretched to the limit, trying to be all things to all people. Even in larger urban congregations, ministry agents can become overwhelmed with the vast number of responsibilities that they are expected to manage well within the church and the community. Bread for the Journey is a one-day course developed for our chaplains where the participants discuss self-care strategies and that foster resilience and strengthen them for their ministry journey. Again, this can be applied to any ministry setting. DRCN is keenly aware of the toll that ministry in a crisis takes on ministry leaders. We've developed a workshop which runs alongside the Bread for the Journey course, known as Caring for Ministers in Crisis. It's an adaptation of our peer support training for our clergy in the Uniting Church. It's focused on the issues for a disaster-affected community, the stresses and risk of compassion fatigue on faith leaders, and strategies to become beside and assist them through a process of listening and education, planning and integration. It is a particularly useful tool in a context where very few religious bodies understand the nature of vicarious traumatization and compassion fatigue for clergy in the recovery phases following a disaster event. I know so many ministers who are no longer in active ministry after going through a disaster. They've just worn themselves out. This resiliency resource is useful not only for local ministers whose communities are experiencing a large-scale disaster, but also in situations of both community and congregational trauma and crisis. Lastly, we are in the process of developing a new resource for ministry agents entitled View to Recovery. This project has gathered information from 3 recent disasters in New South Wales: the Sir Ivan Fire of 2017, the Far North Coast floods of 2017, and the Tathra area bushfires of 2018. This process has been to video interviews with chaplains responding to and local clergy involved in community recovery following these disasters, as well as asking them to complete a written survey about the event. Last week, we workshopped the data and video footage with 15 selected chaplains, and we hope to have the project completed by the end of the year. The project's purpose is to be a resource for ministry agents and to give insights into community disaster recovery through the eyes of ministry agents who themselves have been through the process of recovery following disaster. It's hoped that the lessons learned might be helpful to those facing similar circumstances and also to disaster recovery managers as well, and to encourage those going through long-term recovery that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm going to close with a short video clip of an interview with one of our chaplains who responded to the Far North Coast floods in 2017.
The conversations I believe we had during evacuation and recovery stage played a big part in getting the community back on their feet. So the earlier the intervention of being able to tell story and to process that, and because memory is fluid, being able to put some logic over emotion and to be settled was really lovely just to see that come together.
It's been interesting in our chaplaincy journey that in the beginning we almost had to fight for a space to be in the recovery process. And over the years, our chaplains have been well respected and a crucial part of both the evacuation and recovery process. It's really interesting to me. A few weeks ago, we met in Sydney. We were planning for a mass evacuation event with all of the community partners and other agencies that would be involved in such an event. And I was talking to one of the disaster welfare staff who had been present at the last bushfire that New South Wales experienced. And he came up to me and he said, I want to let you know how much I appreciated you asking me how I was going. He said, you were the only one that did that. And it makes me realize that we may only have to say, how are you traveling, to the people that we work with. And it makes such a huge difference to them. I have with me those resources that I talked about, if you want to spend a few minutes to look at them, and I'd also be happy to answer any questions you might have. But thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.